In three, two, one, you're live.
Hello, 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 Santa Barbara. It's your Chantress of everything valuable and beautiful, Elizabeth Stewart. I don't know how Stephen Bates got in touch with me, but I think it was over a Spanish colonial sideboard. And he said, would you take a look at this sideboard and let me know if it's worth hanging on to in today's market? And we kind of talked about that. And um, I don't know. We got into just, you know how you do that in the email. We got into this little thing where he said, yeah, can I send you some photos? I'm super interested in history. I know you are. And so he sent me some photos that were part of his book. And it's so fun. He wrote a book with a colleague, and I have with us Vincent Burns and Stephen Bates, both authors. And this is the book, Images of America, Rincon Point. And what is so fascinating is all the family background. So, Richard, what you don't know is both of the gentlemen that are on the air with today, they have deep, deep roots in in Rincon Point. And there's some wonderful photos. I mean, I was just agog. Is that still a word? Um,
Yes.
this is uh, uh, Suzanne here, Suzanne Rhodes with Carmelita Hill Rhodes. I mean, some of these pictures are family. And it's fantastic when you think about how deep the roots go. And anyway, so I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about the people that have lived there, how it started off, the kind of vibe that, it's gone through over the years. And let me introduce um, Vince Burns. He's a historian, farmer, publisher. He travels, he writes, he does a regular column on Rincon Point in surf history for the Coastal View News. PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin. Which Wisconsin school?
Oh, Madison, of course.
Oh, that's the best. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm a Midwesterner. You can probably tell by my accent, but
Oh,
yeah.
very
So
good.
yeah, born and raised in Chicago, and then, I lived in Wisconsin for a while. Everybody does. They get bored with Chicago. Anyway, worked in book and database publishing on both coasts for 30 years. And how, and in the book, I was able to discover that Vince helped his grandmother rebuild her house in Rincon Point in the 70s when he was a kid. I mean, fantastic stuff. I mean, you can do a book as a historian and you can use first source materials if you can find them. But if you lived it and you are first source material yourself, your own body, well, that's a whole different thing. And then I have Stephen Bates. I don't know. I got to have an explanation from Stephen here. He's a professor of journalism, currently at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, author of 5 books, articles in Washington Post, The Atlantic, American Heritage. Stephen's great grandfather acquired the entire of Rincon Point in the 1880s, and it remained in the family for more than a century. And he also is a graduate of Harvard Law. And now I'm kind of like, here, Stephen, I want to know what happened because so I have a daughter-in-law who's Duke Law, and she went for her first year. She had a position at Jones Day, and they ate her up and spat her out. Um, and she just said, "Forget it," and she's now pursuing private practice. And I'm wondering, was that something you changed in your career, or you kept law? Tell me a little background, just out of interest, just because I want to tell my daughter-in-law.
I puttered around. I did summer internships when I was in law school with a couple of law firms, and then I did some stuff in government. And after some journalism, I ended up in academia, and academia is by far the best gig I found. Partly June, July, and August. So here I am.
Right. Okay. And then, so I want to hear more about your background too, but in vis-a-vis Rincon Point. And dear listener, if you're interested, I mean, this is such an interesting book because it covers, you can tell by the both men that we kind of introduced, it covers Rincon Point from a standpoint of heredity, of first use purposes, second use purposes, the ranching, and then it goes into really early surf culture, and and it pulls all the threads together in a really wonderful way. And the photos are to die for. And you just have to take a look. You just have to look and see. So this is the author's photographic history of Rincon Point. It's Arcadia Publishing. It's the Images of America series, available at local bookstores and online. And if you have anything to do with Rincon Point, which we all do here in Santa Barbara, this is a fantastic gift for anybody that is, interested in history, interested in surf history, etc. And Vince, I know Greg Gorga is about to leave the Maritime Museum, but do you have this at the museum?
I'm told we do, yeah, and we because they got a great bookstore in the museum,
Yeah.
and Steve and I also were fortunate enough to do a presentation. When was that, Stephen? Was that last spring?
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful place, and I think not everyone necessarily knows about what a amazing location too. So yeah, anyway, we're really pleased to be at that bookstore.
Well, I'm glad to hear
We
it. Yeah, but yeah, so I want to start off with early history, um, California's history, first of all, and it's called Rancho El Rincon. Um, and the book kind of starts that chapter 2 by saying none of the earliest owners of Rancho El Rincon was born under the American flag. And we have to be cautious here in our present day and age, America, what the concept really means, because that's testimony to what the concept really means, as opposed to some other thoughts we might have that the people that were not born in under the American flag were so instrumental in our area. And Stephen, I wonder maybe you could talk about that. We're talking about the 1830s, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, there was a former soldier who petitioned the government of Alta California, which then was controlled by Mexico, to get Rancho El Rincon as a sort of land grant. It was kind of like the Homestead Act in the United States a few decades later, as a reward for his service. His name was Teodoro Arellanes, and after a couple of requests, the government gave it to him. And he requested one square Spanish league, which was 4,400 acres, and was given it as a kind of reward for his good service. He then farmed it and became one of the most successful ranchers in the Santa Barbara area. He owned quite a lot of property beyond Rancho El Rincon, but he apparently considered Rincon one of the most important properties he owned. And when he had trouble confirming his ownership of it after the United States took over, he said it would ruin him to lose this property. So he ultimately was able to confirm it through the courts after the United States took over. And then he deeded it to his son-in-law, Mateo Biggs, who was one of these people born under a different flag. And it wasn't until the 20th century that someone born under the American flag came in. This was partly that there were people born under the Spanish and Mexican flag, but then partly even after the United States took over, there were a lot of people born under the English flag, in the case of my great-grandfather, and other flags who came and were very active in California.
Just very quickly, just so we have a background, your great-grandfather, tell us quickly in a nutshell, because I have another question for you about the early period, but tell us about your great-grandfather and his connection with Rincon.
He was a physician in Santa Barbara, was interested in real estate, probably more interested in that than in medicine. And in 1885, he and a partner acquired Rancho El Rincon from his former medical partner, Dr. Biggs.
Okay, so and he owned it for, I think it was a century or so?
It remained in the Bates family for a century or so, yes.
Okay. And do you remember stories from your forebearers about Rancho El Rincon?
My grandfather grew up on it, and my father grew up on it. So I remember stories that they both told. My grandfather was something of a historian, so he kept a lot of documents and photographs. And he also took photographs. He had a sort of sense of history. So even in the 1920s, when cameras and film were kind of expensive, and he took film, he took photos as well as movies, and made a point of keeping them. So that's where a lot of the materials in the book came from.
That's amazing. So these are photos and is it ephemera or ephemera? I can't ever remember the pronunciation, but the these are in your family. A lot of the material in the book is from your family archive, correct?
Yeah, a lot of it is. We also had we were in touch with a lot of other people whose roots go way back there. Vince was in touch with people who go back 3 or 4 generations on Rincon Point, who had scrapbooks, for example, of early surfing, things like that. Um, we've given a lot of talks all around Santa Barbara on this topic. And one thing that struck me is that there are a lot of people around here who know about Rincon Point, but more to the point, there are a lot of people who care very deeply about Rincon Point. It's a topic that seems to move people. And so people have kept souvenirs and photos and things like that. And we've been very lucky to be able to tap those resources.
Yeah, it's very true. It's an emotional heartstring puller for sure. Now I want to ask you an interesting question because I'm thinking about this in terms of, what's happening in our country right now. So we talk about Arelenus, who received Rancho El Rincon, and he's working it between 1835 and 1885. And at this period, if I understand right, a gentleman named government attorney Pacificus Ord tried to invalidate Teodoro Arellano's claim to Rancho El Rincon. And Arellanos, who owned the rancho, lost before the Federal Land Commission, but won in court. And that seems to be, it's not the first time I've heard that story, where somebody is, it happened with Chinese laborers here in Santa Barbara and water rights. It happened with all kind. I mean, it's just happened that okay, this is given during the Mexican period, and now it's taken away during the American period. And I wonder if you can talk about what's behind that all. I mean, is it the growing knowledge that the land is valuable, or is it maybe a worse fear of, well, we want to own this country. The Western expansion, is our prerogative. It's the white man's burden.
I
So
think
I'm
there's
wondering,
definitely
reflect on those two factors for me, Stephen.
I think there's certainly a good deal of racism behind it. There was also a kind of informality to the record keeping under Mexico and Spain. So the documentation of land ownership was not perhaps as airtight as it was under the United States. So it wasn't as easy for people like Arianas to prove their ownership. And the third factor that I think was really important was a lot of Americans flooded California during the gold rush. Once the gold rush was over, they wanted land to farm, and they saw these huge ranchos controlled by former citizens of this nation that the United States had conquered. And they felt it was unjust that the conquered people controlled so much property. So there was an effort to take their land. through the courts, as in the case of the land grant ranchos with Pacificus Ord, and also through squatters and through intimidation, through all sorts of things. So yes, it's a part of that larger story.
Yeah, I was fearful to ask that question, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that I want to talk about how your people got to Rincon, and it starts off with the Gutierrez immigrating from Chile to California, and take that story from. I mean, it's an amazing story. Take that story from there, Stephen.
Gutierrez came from Chile to California. Dr. Biggs, who came from Peru to California during the gold rush to seek their fortune. They both ended up making their way to Santa Barbara. Gutierrez became a druggist. Biggs became a doctor, although he'd never gone to medical school.
And Biggs is Biggs is in your forebears, right?
Well, Bates is my great grandfather, and he made his own way to Santa Barbara. The three of them then became partners in various ventures, including in a pharmacy, the Gutierrez Pharmacy. Dr. Biggs returned to Latin America and ended up selling what he still owned of Rancho El Rincon to Bates and Gutierrez in partnership. But Bates, I think, was keenly interested in just making money from real estate. His father had been a stockbroker turned preacher and had died more or less destitute. Bates became a doctor, went to medical school to try to make a lot of money that he could invest in real estate. And when he died, one of the medical journals praised him for his acumen as a real estate investor rather than as a doctor. And I think Rancho El Rincon was just another investment for him. Whereas for his son, my grandfather, Robert W. Bates, it was an attachment of the heart. He really loved Rancho El Rincon, Rincon Point.
And how much land did your grandfather own?
Well, it was split up between the Bates and Gutierrez families in 1905, and the Bates family ended up with 755 acres. And bits of it were sold off, but basically the Bates family owned close to 700 acres through most of the 20th century. And my grandfather and my father and his siblings just loved the place, grew up in the place, had all sorts of adventures and misadventures.
Okay, now I want to also bring Vince into this conversation too, Vince. And so your background is similar but different. So tell me about your relationship to Rincon.
Sure. Well, compared to Stephen's family, I'm a very much a relative newcomer. Only go back to I guess the 1970s, and my connection is my grandmother, Helen Andresen, an old Martha's Vineyard Yankee who ended up marrying a Californian and moving out here. She was a very wise woman, and there were my grandparents lived in Pasadena for the most part, and they had a family property at Balboa by Newport there, which they loved. But you may remember in the 60s and 70s, it got, and I'm thinking of there's a famous surf spot called the Wedge there at Newport, and it became more and more. It just, like everything in California, it just got more and more crowded there. And they had what was the original house out there, and suddenly they were surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of houses. And it was the 60s and 70s, and surfing was going strong. And you had motorcycle, everyone was sort of cruising down in front of their house on their loud motorcycles. And my grandfather, I remember him being upset he couldn't even find any parking in front of his own house, which just irritated him no end. And my grandfather was sort of a good Nixon Republican, if you know the type from California in the '60s, and so he occasionally he would go out to his front door, and a hippie, my God, a hippie would be using his hose to take a bath or something, and that was just way too much for my grandfather. So he put the house at Balboa up for sale, and they my grandparents commenced looking for an alternative, and they it turned out that there's sort of was a Pasadena contingent at Rincon Point, and it still exists to some extent. So they had friends who had sort of discovered Rincon and bought and built little bungalows and so on, and they wanted in on that, so they took some of their money from selling the other property and bought a lot from Stephen's uncle, basically
Oh,
on the water, just barely on the Santa Barbara County side at Rincon. And I guess it may frustrate people given prices of real estate these days, but I believe it was $80,000 for the lot. Um, I don't think you could what you could rent maybe a couple months at a rental at Rincon now without. So
you could not use a porta potty for that money.
Yeah, exactly. And my grandmother built a very nice home that we enjoy in about 1974, 75, I believe is when I was working on it. And then unfortunately, my grandfather passed away, but she ended up her last 20 years or so of her life, she lived happily at Rincon Point with all the surfers next door. There was a vacant lot next door. That's actually where Kevin Costner lived for a while. And uh, they, I used to tease my grandmother because all the surfers would be disrobing basically in the vacant lot next to her, to get their wetsuits on and off. And I would, and I'd come in and say, well, look, oh, Grandma, all these naked men over there. What do you think of that? Anyway, she got along perfectly with all the surfers. And anyway, I'll give you another real estate figure. I think building the house and actually furnishing it was only like my grandfather kept great records. So it was, I think there was like 130,000 to build the house and to bring in the appliances and whatnot, which is just like you say is just sort of the realtor's commission these days or something. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's how and my after my grandmother passed away, my mother has kept it up and mostly in this century. And yeah, we're very lucky. There's no way our family would be able otherwise to have a home there. It's I guess like lots of places in Santa Barbara, it's not just it used to be sort of for well-off people, doctors and lawyers and whatnot. But lately it's you're talking just such obscene amounts of money that it only sort of stock market folks or maybe Hollywood can afford to live there. And as a consequence, one of the interesting things, maybe not the best news, is that it's there's a lot fewer full-time residents there now, and you have people who come in on maybe the weekend or a couple of weeks a year, and so there's a little bit less, maybe others would disagree, of a sense of community at Rincon Point than there was maybe in Stephen's family's day.
So I want to know if you two can contrast, like you're talking about, and oh, Richard's giving me a sign. We got to go quick break, but I'll throw this out for maybe after the break. So Vince Burns is talking about this really intelligent female strain in the Burns family, where they're buying and they're thinking of the future and they're kind of entrepreneurs and they're really free spirits, is what you're describing. So your grandfather's not okay with the hippies, taking a bath in his garden hose, but your grandmother's fine with naked men all over the place from next door because she's a different type of person. She's a real, free spirit. She's interested in life in general for, 20 days, 20 years after your grandfather goes. And Stephen's people, they're solid, they're professional people, the Bates family, you've got medicine involved, et cetera. You've got very sort of earthy, down to earth. Um, from what I'm picking up from the book, his grandfather and his father. And then his father's kind of an interesting man because he's so emotionally connected with Rincon. And I want you to contrast the people that in your families, like Vince, if you can contrast your grandparents and with Stephen, maybe your grandparents, and talk about how different they are as people and what kind of people then were occupants of Rincon at that time. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the 20s, aren't we here? Yeah. And so maybe when we get back from the break, we can real time contrast, your forebears, because it sounds like they're very different people. Um, and it sounds like there's different culture that's happening around Rincon as well. Yeah. So, okay, Richard, let's go to quick break. Back from break. I just want to reintroduce. I have had a fantastic time with this book, Rincon Point, Images of America, Vincent Burns and Stephen Bates. Another question is how two authors actually managed to write together, which I could never conceive of. But at any rate, a marvelous job. It's Arcadia's Publishing, and we learned that Stephen's personal family archive supplies a lot of the photos in the book. Um, and there's a ton of photos. On every page, there's at least one or two, or maybe even three. So I'm talking with Stephen Bates, professor of journalism at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, author of 5 books, and I want to find out the other 5 as well. And Vince Burns, historian, former publisher, a travel writer, and a columnist, all very interested in surf history as well. And did you see Vince at the Maritime Museum? Did you see the artist Comer, how he painted all the surfboards
I
and
did
this?
so.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. So I love the combination of, you know, um, the artistry of the surfboard, the physics of the surfboard and all the shapers and the makers that we've had here, and then the artists that actually took that under the wing and went for it. That's such a favorite exhibit of mine. I just loved it, the artistry. Anyway, so Rich, let's go to quick break. We get back. I want to talk about the grandparents and how they were different. I don't know if you ever talked about that, but I want to hear what you have to say. Don't turn the dial. Back in a minute. Do I have time to go to the potty, Richard?
In 3, 2, 1, you're live.
Welcome back. A fantastic interview during the actual well, our presentation is just so fun because it's about Rincon Point in Images of America. Vincent Burns and Stephen Bates, um, wonderful historians, academics, um, authors, writers for many, many years got together, and they both have family that either helped settle the point, colonize the point, surf the point. I want to start with Stephen. Give me a character description of your grandparents and when and how they owned, what the house was like, their friends. Give me a background of their existence on the point.
My grandfather was in charge of the ambulance, the Red Cross Ambulance Corps in Italy during World War One. And at the very end of the war, he married a French nurse who had been taking care of him when he had appendicitis, sailed back and settled at Rincon Point. He had told her that there was a river running through this property. It was a beautiful river. At least that was what she understood. And when they got there, I think her heart sort of sank, seeing a little Rincon Creek trickling through. They built a house. They initially lived in the Hills house, which they rented up on a hilltop. there, the Hill family house. And then built a tiny board and batten cottage at the edge of Rincon Creek, which flooded and which had to be moved, I think, at least 3 times. They ended up having 4 kids, and I think had a sort of adventurous existence, and a fun existence for parents as well as children. They sold lots to others. Other family members then joined them down there. And it was through the 20s and 1930s, I think, pretty informal. Things, my Uncle Edward, my grandfather's brother, said that they had to have owners who would tolerate things like the water going out. If the water pump failed, they would just call up and say, there's no water again. And they would wait around for Edward to fix it, things like that. Warner Oland, who was a very successful movie actor at the time, best known for playing Charlie Chan, and his wife bought several house lots and spent quite a lot of time there. I guess that was the Kevin Costner of the day. But other than that, I think they were mostly people from around the area and became very friendly. It was a kind of real community. And that was true of Warner Oland as well. He and his wife took one of my aunts, who was a little girl at the time, to a movie premiere, and they hosted people at their house and things like that. So I think it was a sort of scruffy, easygoing group of people who loved the environment, loved being there, and were willing to make some sacrifices for it, sacrifices in terms of inconvenience.
Okay, so they were actually a little bit entrepreneurial. They were not like straight-laced people. They kind of, am I on the right track?
I think so. They were willing to improvise and make go. They weren't expecting sort of life of ease and servants and things like that.
So then the folks that you talk about that bought a couple houses down, the Asian family, tell me about them.
Well, my grandfather, when he came back from the war, decided he was going to make a go of it as a farmer starting on Rincon Point. And he spent thousands of dollars and failed. He had no experience farming, but I think he figured as a smart, hardworking fellow, he could figure it out. And it turned out that was not the case. It turned out that you actually did need some experience farming to be a successful farmer. So he recruited a Japanese farmer who was working on a farm in Bardsdale named Kajuro Oda as a sharecropper, brought him to Rincon Point, built him a house that was the same layout as the Bates house, the Bates cottage, and brought him there with his family as a sharecropper. And he was fabulously successful as a farmer, starting on Rincon Point and then on the rest of the Rincon Ranch up on the hills behind it, and made a go of it, made the Rincon Ranch a success as a farm, which my grandfather had been unable to do.
Amazing. And the photographs are fantastic. I mean, they're just wonderful from that whole section on the neighbors there, and that such successful ranchers love this. I mean, that whole spread. See, dear listener, this is radio, but I'm holding up pictures of what Stephen's describing, the Ota family and the Bates family, and how the Ota family became really successful farmers and the Bates family not so much. So, how interesting. All right, contrast now, Vince, your grandparents.
Well, let's see. So, like I said, my grandparents weren't able to sort of grow up at Rincon, and they didn't have this century long experience there, and but it was always. I mentioned my grandmother was a Martha's Vineyarder, and she would go back. She didn't forsake that, and she would go back twice a year by train, I guess beginning in the 30s all the way up until the 70s and 80s.
So
Um,
may I interrupt you? She kept her house on the vineyard?
she had some property there, and she had built one house in Vineyard Haven, restored the barn. So she always called it was a beautiful house, but she always called it the barn. And she so she had that property and a couple others, and she would rent those out during the popular the summer season, and to tourists. And so she would go out prior to the season and prepare the house for rental, and then she would go back in the fall and sort of clean up and close it down, right, for the winter. Back then no one lived on the vineyard, and except for locals in the winter. And so she did sort of see herself as sort of a, she was very nautical in a sense, and people in the family were I think everyone on Martha's Vineyard and who were locals were expected to be sailors, and so she did have that tradition going for her. And then, like I said, my grandfather unfortunately passed away fairly soon after they built their home, and so he wasn't able to put in too much of a stamp on the place. But in the beginning, I would say in the 50s and running up until maybe present day, maybe 20, 30 years ago, you had, like I said, you had a Pasadena contingent. You had other folks who made, who became friends, and had this shared a neighborhood at Rincon. And so they would have a sort of standing cocktail hour at 5 o'clock, and everyone would troop over to whoever's house it was that afternoon, and I think you were supposed to bring your bottle so you wouldn't deplete the supplies of the host. And I was also told that it was supposed to wrap up right at 6. So no, it didn't start a whole night drinking, but just a very business-like cocktail hour. And it does sort of give me a sense of this sort of very nostalgic era in California history, where some of the challenges we have today with the population, or we don't obviously see eye to eye on everything politically, and that there was this sort of what seems like a, a very maybe naive, but also a very attractive seeming period when California was booming. You had the whole baby boom. You had surfing was just becoming a thing in the early 60s, just exploding out of California. And you had, it was Carpinteria that was at the point when the subdivisions in Carpinteria were being built. Concha Loma, one of the most famous ones, where I'm probably guessing, but I think that track probably opened up in the early 50s. And you had many of Carpinteria's sort of famous surfers grew up there in Concha Loma, and they were able to ride their bikes, whether Rincon or other places in Carp, to surf. And you just had this sort of glorious um, beach surf experience going on, that just seems so wonderful in hindsight.
Well, you mentioned, I want to, Richard's giving us a sign. Richard, do we go to break, or do we just finish off? We go to break. Okay, let's go to quick break. And then I want to talk about is what you brought up, Vince, the cocktail hour and booze in relationship. I mean, I was fascinated by the story about the Hotel Rincon and prohibition in the book, and all of the various people that were kind of seedy around all that. Harry Goldflam, for example. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that sort of a scandal story to end the hour. And don't turn that down. We'll be back. I'm talking with Stephen Bates and Vince Burns. Both people have wonderful forebears that spent a lot of time and energy and gave of themselves to Rincon Point, over generations, and how fantastic. And Vince still has his house there. Marvelous, marvelous. Celebrating the book, by the way. Rincon Point, Images of America, Arcadia Publishing, available all of our bookstores and at the Maritime Museum. And these two gentlemen have been giving a lot of really interesting lectures along the way. So anyway, Richard, let's go to a quick break, and then we're going to hear about the story of the Hotel Rincon and the history of booze on Rincon Point. Don't turn that down.
All right, you have 5 minutes. When you come back, you'll have 5 minutes.
It's the infamous Hotel Rincon is that's Stephen's the expert on that one, so he'll take us through that.
All right. Elizabeth's, I think, getting her tea, what have you. Oh. Oh my.
It says here, Reverend Dr. D.
Correct.
Not Dr. Demento, though.
No. He is a genre all unto himself, and I appreciate that genre too.
Oh,
Along with other satirists and supporters of satire like Stan Freberg.
oh yeah. Yeah,
One of my heroes.
I grew up listening to Dr. Demento in LA in the 70s. I was surprised to find out he was still around.
Fish heads. Roly-poly fish heads.
Oh,
All right.
God, yeah.
Final segment, Elizabeth. 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. You're live.
So I wanted to talk about the Hotel Rincon opening in 1915. And yeah, I understand that in 1916, Santa Barbara clergy condemned the owners because they served alcohol to minors, and they employed a 14-year-old girl as an exhibition dancer and engaged in immoral conduct. I mean, of course they did. I mean, that's what it's for, right? So, tell me about the hotel.
Well, it's funny. It was a sort of roadhouse, and to have a roadhouse, you first need a road, and it followed the causeway, the great wooden causeway that helped drivers get past Rincon Point. So that brought drivers along, and they needed a place to stay and eat, and especially drink. So that was where they went. A guy named Bert Clark started the place in 1915. Had trouble getting a liquor license, ended up moving on. Several other people came along and took it over. Finally, Harry Goldflamp took it over during Prohibition, and it got raided time after time. He finally ended up going to jail, and then under sort of mysterious circumstances got a presidential pardon from President Harding, and got released with just a few weeks left on his jail sentence. President Harding was sort of famously corrupt, but it appears to have been on the up and up. President Harding apparently believed Harry Goldflamp's claims to be severely ill. So that was the story of the hotel.
So the county line passed through the hotel? What is that all about?
Well, that was a famous bit of lore, that the county line ran through the hotel, and that to avoid getting arrested, all you had to do was hop across the county line, so that when the Ventura police raided it, you could just jump over Santa Barbara County. But the county line didn't run through the hotel, and they could chase you across the line even if it did.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I just have to, one more shout out, the totally fun, completely, what do you call it, multi-spectrumed book on Rincon Point, Images of America, Arcadia Publishing, by Vince Burns and Stephen Bates, both with family that are residents or have been residents, and longtime commitments and longtime connections with the Rincon. And what's so fabulous about this is the many pictures. I mean, this is such a great gift for somebody that loves history, that loves surfing, that loves the farming history, that loves all the early scandals around Santa Barbara area. It's such a really cool read. And I thank you, Stephen. I thank you, Vince, for coming on. Next time we talk, I will talk about oil too, and the impact of oil on Rincon Point. And I'd love to have you guys back. But thank you so much for being here today.
Our pleasure. Thank you for the chance.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you guys. And I'll send you